a delight to be here. Seriously, I haven't been back to the Air Force Academy for 5 or 6 years, and see they organize the weather appropriately. But this is an amazingly important event. Thanks to Joel, to the Center for Leadership and Development, to you cadets, John Stanley in particular, who has supported me while I've been here this week. It's a very enjoyable place to come. So the senior enlisted advisor, the senior enlisted leader of the Air Force, had a chart up and it said profession of arms. Profession. How do we understand that concept? I want to spend a little bit of time today helping you understand that concept. For instance, how many would say that the Denver Broncos are professionals? You're all wrong. They're entertainers. We know that. They're very high-priced entertainers, but they are not professionals. Not in the sense I'm using the word. There are 3 ways you can produce something in America, in any Western democratic country. I don't care if you want to produce driver's licenses, or you want to produce a very entertaining football team, or you want to produce people who defend the republic. There's 3 social organizations that can produce that. A business operates under the profit motive, a bureaucracy, which operates under highly centralized, directed control, or a profession, which are people to whom the society grants immense autonomy to do their work. Why? Because what professions do is they provide something that the society must have to flourish, but cannot produce itself. I can't heal myself. I want to go to a doctor. I can't represent myself before the bar, but I want justice, so I'll go to a lawyer. And citizens of the Republic cannot defend themselves. So they turn to their military, and they expect that military to be a profession. Unfortunately, or fortunately, depending on how you view it, and that's a whole nother debate as a political scientist, when our republic was founded, all the military departments were created as governmental bureaucracies, right under the control of the Congress, just the way the Congress wanted it. Why? Because the Army in 1775, the first branch to be created before the Declaration of Independence, before the Constitution, the Continental Army was created out of colonial militias, and colonial militias were tightly controlled by colonial legislatures. Today, Congress will only appropriate manpower for your military department 1 year at a time. They don't trust you to go beyond 1 year at a time. We all know it's an amazing, inefficient, and horrible way of doing business. But that's the result of the fact that the Air Force and the Army and the Navy are governmental bureaucracies. And this is what a bureaucracy looks like over here. They do not deal with expert knowledge. The focus is on efficiency. That's why they only give you things a year at a time. You're closely supervised. They tend to invest in processes, not people. Remember, in a bureaucracy, you can retrain someone very quickly. How long does it take to train someone to work in a driver's license bureau? Not long. How long does it take to develop the expert knowledge of air power, or land power, or sea power? So there's an immense contrast between a bureaucratic structure and a professional structure. Now, the difficulty for the military departments is that they are also, by choice and by desire of the American people, professions. And professions are fundamentally different than bureaucracies. Professions deal in expert work. It takes a life to learn it. We practice our knowledge. We practice our knowledge between our ears and the use of our voice and hands. What is the professional practice of a military professional? The repetitive exercise of discretionary judgment. That's what you do. How many times a day? Whether you're sitting in the Pentagon allocating shortages, or whether you're out on the flight line, or whether you're over in the Middle East, military professionals every day are making repetitive judgments. How many of those judgments every day are high in moral content? And remember, they're discretionary judgments. Nobody in the Congress tells you what to decide. They don't tell you how to fight wars. Nobody in Congress comes down and tells you how to write your doctrines. The Army just wrote a totally new doctrine for complex warfare. A completely new, for 40 years, a completely new system of command and control. We don't even use the word command and control anymore. It's all mission command. Mission command. Power down. I trust you to do this. Operate within my intent. Execute with prudential judgment. I'll back you up. That's how we have to operate in the land of complexity. Wars among the peoples in the population centers, and that's what's coming. We're not going back to tank on tank, the big conventional battles of the past. So over here on the side of professions, it's fundamentally different than the side of bureaucracies. So the great challenge of the Department of the Air Force, Department of the Army, is that the senior leaders in those organizations every day have to get up and they have to take this organization, which is organized hierarchically as a bureaucracy, and they got to make it behave this way. And folks, that's called leadership. That's what leadership does in the military. Leadership in the military takes a bureaucratic structure, makes it behave professionally, because that's how the American people want their military service provided. Now, the Army has spent the last 4 years thinking through this process. What's it mean to be a military profession? We have never had, until last year, official doctrine of what it means to be a profession. We could not have a conversation in the Army. Could you have one in the Air Force today? We finally wrote last year and published. Chief of Staff, Secretary of the Army signed it. We have a 35-page doctrine that defines the Army profession. We're redoing it this year, and we're putting in it an additional chapter on the ethic, because last year, frankly, we couldn't get far enough along that we were comfortable publishing doctrine on the ethic. We are this year, for the first time, publishing doctrine on ethic. So let me go back and put these two sides together. When we started this research project, I started this research project with a group of colleagues at West Point 12 years ago. We now have published 4 books and finally have the Army adopting its own doctrine of profession, of what it means to be a military profession. When we started, we did an interview around the Army. We asked young officers, come to us, symbologic research, qualitative, bring a symbol of what it means to be a professional. We're going to talk about, and I'm going to get out of your head what you understand the meaning of professional to be. What does it mean? One officer came and brought nothing, 0. And we said, well, what's it mean to you to be a professional? He said, I'm not a professional. We said, tell us more. He said, well, I'm in Transportation Corps. I'm a transportation planner. I've got a graduate degree at the same university that the transportation planners that work for Walmart. In fact, in 1 more year, I'm going to resign from the Army and go to work for Walmart. And I don't consider myself a professional. And we said, well, why haven't you developed some conception of what it means to be a professional? You got 14 years of service. He says, he looked us right in the eye and said, how can I be a professional if there is no profession? Think about that. He'd served 14 years in the Army and could not see a profession. Cadets, can you see a profession at the Air Academy? Officers, do you see a profession in the Air Force? Can you talk about it? Do you understand what makes it? Can you communicate about it? See, what this young fellow was pointing out is what is true, because we took this up in our research project and looked at it. There is no history in America of a professional ever having been developed in a bureaucracy. Lions do not eat hay. It's characterological. Bureaucracies do not produce professionals. They produce bureaucrats. Any of you cadets in here sign up to be a bureaucrat? Bureaucrats are not bad people. We need them. We have bureaucracies in the Army. We need contained, good, efficient bureaucracies. We don't want the whole Army being a bureaucracy. We want the whole Army being a profession. So he gave us 2 great insights. The first great insight is you can't develop as a professional if you're operating in a bureaucratic institution and culture. You just can't get there. And one of the reasons you can't get there is they both have different means of social control. The means of social control in a profession is the ethic, and I'll turn to that next. That's what ethics do. Ethics provide a means of controlling both the institution and the people. This is not just about controlling the people. You've got to control the institution first so that it's behaving like a profession, then you got a chance to develop. And the connection between this level of analysis of the institution and this level of analysis of the individual professional, the connection is moral leadership. Leadership in accord with an ethic. So let's turn to the next chart. Oh, it's up. This is how far we got last year when we published the Army's doctrine. This is all we could say about the Army's ethic. And look at the chart, folks. Our conclusion was we got too many ethics. So we took all the ethics of the Army, all those things that Army professionals considered to guide us, legally and morally, and we said, let's array them. So we put on this side everything that's codified. On this side, we put all that are not codified. And at the top, we put all those that apply to the institution, and at the bottom, we put all those that apply to the individual. And that's why I entitled my paper, An Army of Too Many Ethics. Here we were, finishing a project for the Chief of Staff and Secretary, writing doctrine for the first time in 240 years of Army history. To have doctrine on profession, and this is all the further we could get with the ethic. Because in fact, throughout our history, we've had too many ethics, and they're wonderful ethics. They work very well in subcultures. Our non-commissioned officer corps will not give up the NCO creed, and we don't want them to. I was a Ranger. I will not give up the Ranger creed.
Well,
I mean, this is just how subcultures work. However, the profession needs to have a undergirding all of those, an understanding of what are the moral and ethical principles, and not just the principles, but the moral identity of the professional behaving under those principles. What is that? So that was our project this year. We just completed it last week. We just got Chief of Staff and Secretary of Army signatures last week. We're now starting the publication process. And a second version of the Army profession will be published in June, and it will have a full chapter on the ethic. And in that will be a one-page ethic of moral identities. And incidentally, we went out to the junior enlisted in the Army and vetted all this at several workshops around the Army. And they told us what they wanted their moral identity to be, and they hit it exactly on the head. They said, we want to be known as trusted Army professionals. That's it, nothing else. Trusted, there's only one currency in professions, folks, it's trust. Just one currency. A junior, a follower, trust a leader, etc. One currency. They wanted to be trusted Army professionals. To that, we added 3 sub-identities. Expert, because you are a professional, servant, and steward. So that we have an explicit acknowledgement among the senior leaders of the Army that they are the stewards of the profession. Remember, folks, professions do not perpetuate themselves. It is not the case, once a profession, always a profession. I served in Europe as the Chief of War Plans at the height of the Cold War. I had 28 war plans, all the classified, unclassified, black, and some I still can't talk about today in the nuclear realm. At the time I was in Europe, there were 7 land armies that were professionals. Today, there are 3. 3. Some of you folks fought with them in Iraq and Afghanistan. What happened to the rest of them? They still wear uniforms. They're still wearing uniforms. They're obedient military bureaucracies. They are not professions. As a researcher, when I go out and look at a military organization and say, are you a profession? I'd look for 2 things. Are you creating new expert knowledge? And do you take that knowledge and put it in humans to practice? If those 2 things are occurring, you're behaving as a profession. If they're not, you're a government bureaucracy. Government bureaucracies do not win wars. So we wanted a moral identity of stewards so that our senior leaders understood they steward the profession. It is a valuable treasure of the Republic, and therefore responsible for the effectiveness of the Army, not today, 10 years down the road, 6 years down the road. That's their role. My final point on the ethic. over here on this side of the ethic, the obligation, the motivation produced under the codified portion of our ethic is what we know as the motivation of obligation, and it is generally known as the concept of duty. I'm responsible to do my duty. I must do my duty. In fact, we have under UCMJ and under this code, the Standards of Exemplary Conduct, if you do not do your duty, we can prescribe punishments under UCMJ for dereliction of duty. So on this side, what the motivation from the institution to the individual through leadership, that motivation is one of duty, obligation. Folks, that's the minimum standard. It's known throughout America. The law is the minimum standard. It's the least we can all agree with. That's why when we give awards for valor, it says above and beyond the call of duty. Above and beyond the call of duty, because you were not operating over here on this motivation, you were operating on the motivation of the moral side of your ethic. And the motivation of the moral side of your ethic is the motivation of aspiration. We lead by vision and by authenticity and by integrity so that followers aspire. They are inspired to do and to become. The quote you just saw from John Quincy Adams is a historic example of someone who understood this form of leadership. This form of leadership over here, the quid pro quo and the awards and punishments, that's transactional leadership. You don't use that in professions. You use that in bureaucracies. Not in professions. In professions, you motivate and lead by what is known in the literature as authentic leadership or transformational leadership. Inspiring. Tapping into the potential of the individual of what they want to become and to do and to be a part of. And this is the life of a calling. In the Latin, vocare, out of the theology, meaning that the work is more important than the worker. Therefore, you can make self-sacrificial acts. The doctors who just went to Africa to treat Ebola, they knew they could die. That was a calling. A lot of people follow callings, not just in the military, but it is unique to the military for the following reason. We are a lethal profession. My final point, there's a wonderful moral philosopher taught at the Air Force War College for years at Maxwell, Jim Toner. Only 4 purposes for an American soldier: to prepare to kill and under right authority to kill. And since you're in the killing business, to prepare to die and when necessary to die. That's the military profession. That's what sets the military profession apart from every other profession in America, is the lethality of what we deal with. So, that's my point. My question to you would be, and the research questions I brought here and left with the Air Force is, where is the doctrine of the Air Force as a profession? How are you preparing to have a dialogue on what it means to be a profession? And if you can't discuss what it means to be a profession, then how can you develop professionals in the context of that? Because what connects those two levels is moral leadership under an established ethic and a calling to a way of life. So what are your questions? Please.
Is there any literature that you'd recommend reading into about this contrast between bureaucracies and professions?
Yes, there's an extensive literature. To save you time, I would not go into the administrative literature. We've published 2 large anthologies on military professions. One was published in 2002, one was published in 2005. There are 3 chapters in both of those that contrast bureaucracy to profession in the military. In fact, one of the best chapters was a study done in Army Special Operations Forces, which are well ahead, were at that time well ahead of the rest of the Army in establishing the identity of profession. The book is entitled The Future of the Army Profession, 1st edition and 2nd edition. I mean, they're rather large anthologies, so don't pick them up unless you're, the first one's about 400 pages and the second one's about 600. But the chapters are short. The chapters are short. These are when we started the research for the Army, I'd been in the research business in Washington before, and so I knew a lot of the national level researchers on the subject of professions and civil-military relations. So we used all those, and then we tapped into military scholarship. There's an immense amount of military scholarship, a lot of it residing right here at this academy. You've got folks here who can think their way through this process in 2 years. Thanks for asking. Please.
Sir, as someone who's be training incoming cadets this summer, how do you instill this value of being a professional in something that may not be considered a profession by your definition? How do you implant that into somebody who is just joining the military?
You don't do it rapidly, okay? Your senior enlisted leader was absolutely right because he articulated late in his discussion this morning the general tenets of what at least West Point uses in its character development model, and I think what you're using here at the Air Force. It is a process that takes a certain level of preparation. It takes a certain level of knowledge, so you can teach some moral understanding of profession. Preparation, knowledge, it takes an immense amount of experiential learning, which comes from two sources: prototypical role models and reflective practice. You've got to have time to have reflective practice. You have to think about what you're doing and why. That's the process of long-term learning that professionals go by. And the last thing it takes, which he did not mention explicitly, but is in every model I've studied of human development, time. Maturation does not occur quickly. So my advice to you and your colleagues, if you want to teach them professional, show it to them. Quite often we speak so loudly that they can't see what we're saying. Do not let that happen. One of the great exercises we've had in the Army over the years as I go around and lecture and teach on this subject is I ask the people in the room to tell me, or to tell themselves, we do this in work groups so that they can have active reflection on it, tell each other when you suddenly discovered you were a professional. The aha moment, when did it happen? Some of you in the room reflect on that. It doesn't happen to everybody at the same point because people maturate at a different level. For most people, it will not occur in an undergraduate educational environment because to be a professional means you have to understand the responsibilities as you execute them and see the results and understand what the whole purpose of the exercise is and why it's okay to be self-sacrificial. That's not exactly inside human nature. And those conversations, it's interesting, as many as we have had, those conversations in almost every case, the individual can point at that point in time and they will relate another person as part of influencing that decision. They saw the role model and finally understood that's what it means to be a professional. Now I put it together. Now I know who I want to become and therefore what I want to do. Being before doing. Excellent question.
I can speak to that a little bit. Just briefly, the last few points is what I briefed General Johnson and the rest of the generals yesterday about the application to the academy. Because we say we want cadets to be committed to being in the military, committed to the military as a calling, and not being committed to being a pilot, being a recruited athlete, being, getting in free education. But the only way to do that, to have us become professionals, is if the academy itself as an institution is a profession. And this doesn't mean that General Williams and the cadet wing needs to have a bunch of M5s to teach us about profession. It's the whole academy as an institution. It's the faculty being professionals and teaching us what it is to be in a profession. It's the cadet chain of command showing us the same thing. The AOCs, the AMTs, it's the whole academy as an institution that has to be professional. And that's, as you said, that's the only way we can be professionals is if the academy itself is a profession. And really quick, going along with being a professional is using that type of leadership. So transformational, authentic, not transactional. I know what that means because I was taught that in Behavioral Science 310. I know what it is to have a self-policing ethic and all that. But to the 3 degrees in the room, do you know what that means? Let me ask a different question. How many of you use Chick-fil-A as a way to bribe people to pass your knowledge tests? 1 second. So that's a problem because in, 90 days, you guys will be taking positions as NCOs in the cadet wing. And some of you may not even take that class until the spring. And we only have 1 class devoted to that. That's an issue. So that's why we talked to General Johnson about that. It's too late. We've been habituated to transactional because that's the way the academy is right now. So it needs to begin from day 1 at the academy of this is how you should be leading people. This is what you should be doing. So it's not just about changing 1 class, it's about how the whole academy is. And going along with that, so maybe we can't change that, but as an individual, I can set the example. I can show the people beneath me that I care about them, that I'm not just going to use a carrot and a stick. So it's the same way with the faculty, with the cadets. As individuals, we can do that. And I'll just wrap up, but the whole point of this presentation was not to have us just show you some data, show you some ideas, and then you say, okay, great, I got it, good. No, it's about having a discussion. It's about you going back once we finish today and wrestling with these ideas. So that's why, in semi-closing, that's why we have those questions. You know, what is the doctrine and profession we have? If we don't have one, what should it be? What is the content and the motivations of the ethic that we have as a branch? And finally, kind of think about how do we lead people? What is the dominant type of style that we have? Not just among the cadet wing, but also among the faculty and among the cadet, the CW side of the house as well. So with that, we can open it back up to questions, but I just kind of wanted to put a little bit in context. Stallman, you had a question? Oh, okay, all right.
Over here in the back.
My question is, do you feel that there's no room for transactional leadership at all in the military?
No, I don't think there is. If that's what we descend to, we've completely destroyed the whole idea of being professionals in a profession. I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think there's always ways to get around that. Yes, sometimes there is consequences with actions, but that doesn't mean I should go to that method.
I would qualify it a little bit. Depending on the maturity of the follower, there are times that transactional leadership is required, but it should not be very often. If that follower cannot develop rather quickly to the point that there is responsiveness to transformational leadership, then I seriously would question whether that person is going to make a good airman. But no, there are occasions where transactional leadership is still required.
Absolutely. So as of right now, we're pretty beholden to the veto model, and if we are trying to instill this transformational leadership in our 4 degrees when they first show up, how do we change those of us that have already gone through this model, that have already learned transactional? How do we change that right now to address our incoming 4 degrees? Because we can't change them if we can't change ourselves, and we've already been conditioned to this transactional level of leadership.
Yeah, but this is a very short conversation, so we're making some black and white distinctions here. I gave a presentation where I made very black and white distinctions for purposes of emphasis, but let me assure you, you're not a black and white person. All human beings are extremely malleable. I mean, we all deal with cognitive dissonance. We can hold conflicting opinions in our mind at the same time. You can, if you understand, and once you take the course on transformational leadership, you can change your own style of leadership. You don't have to have someone, yes, you'll need some reflection on it. As you do it, you'll need some 360 evaluations, you'll need some feedback. You can make the transition. I'm not concerned about that at all. It can be done. Don't ever underestimate the adaptability of the human.
For Dr. Snyder, I'm wondering, do you find that the emphasis of the military as a profession conflicts with other professions within the military, such as I'm an aviator, professional aviator, there's medical professionals, other professions within the military?
Yeah, we've had extensive discussions on this. Inside the military, you have nested professions, medical, dental, veterinarian, theology. That's not uncommon. They can do that. criteria is that while they may have their own particular operational ethic for their part of the profession, they really need to ascribe to the larger ethic of the institution, the moral principles that undergird this multiplicity of small ethics, of creeds and codes and oaths. So I don't find that difficult at all, and we are not in, I've had extensive discussions. Frankly, our lawyers, our JAGs are a little upset that I keep reminding folks that the legal side is the minimum standard and that the moral side is the higher standard. Once they got over that, they're perfectly comfortable with everything we're doing. Don't forget, when we write doctrine for the Army, it has to go through every one of those communities and be cleared. And so every community has bought into this doctrine, including the Army civilians. I don't have time to discuss that. It was a major point of debate in the 2 years that we worked on this about who's in the profession and who's out. Contractors are out. They work under a profit motive. Civilians, Army civilians, are in by decision of the Chief of Staff and the Secretary of the Army, because we know we cannot fight as an expeditionary force without civilians deployed in the theater of operation. So we are now undertaking an immense effort to professionalize our civilian corps. Let me leave it there.
You talk a lot about the duality of organizational structure between bureaucracy and profession. You also talked about sort of like how it can start at the lowest level possible, the individual. So my question is, at what point does, at an organizational level, the culture becomes so transactional to a point where it becomes proliferates into a larger problem? Because it seems to me that with Chick-fil-A, your example, I feel like that's more at an individual basis. I think that's sort of like, that's incumbent on the leadership or the leader to develop in his own way, his or her own way. So I guess my question, in creed and doctrine, when does that sort of develop into a problem where now we're going back and writing new doctrine for the Army?
Nope. Yeah, let me answer. Let's not become pessimistic here.
Yeah.
My intention in this discussion, and to relate to you how the Army's worked its way through this process, is not to cause pessimism. Some leadership challenges are harder than others. So if you go in as the leader at the middle level of the Army, you may go in to follow a toxic leader who had done nothing but lead by transactional leadership. That's an immense leadership challenge. But we know from empirical data, the culture, not the culture, but the climate of that unit can be changed in many cases within 12 months. Leadership counts. It all depends on the size of the unit, the scope of the unit, etc. I do not despair at all for the institution of the Army or the Air Force having difficulty with this. What I am most concerned about is, do the Army and the Air Force, and are they developing enough leaders who know how to be good leaders? If they know how to be good leaders, then we will create organizational climates and institutional cultures that are quite satisfactory for what we need. The challenge is leader development. Since General Ordinaro became the Chief of Staff of the Army and announced to Congress, I have one priority in the Army, and it was first, and every year he has testified on the Army posture statement, his first priority is absolutely the same every year. Leader development. We are a human institution. We fight our wars humanly. War is a contest of human will. You can have all the technology in the world and not win a war. So if I would be concerned about anything, it's the quality of leader development. That's the challenge. Joe, are we out of time?
Well, we will continue the conversation. So our next speaker is going to speak, and this is going to continue. But I do want to make sure we're able to wrestle with the next subject that we're going to talk about. So please keep your questions in mind. This is a valuable conversation. I will just say to the cadets in the room, if you're hearing something new here, and maybe you're hearing it before you're supposed to in BS 310, be ready to take this back to your squadron now. Be ready to think about this and lead this way and spread the word about this. It's not just here at the Air Force Academy that we struggle with transactional leadership and transformational leadership. We struggle with it in Big Air Force. You guys are the beginning to starting to spread this out to the rest of the Air Force. And you can do it right now in 37th Squadron and 27th Squadron. Okay, so Cadet Tarantino, you're up.
Yes, sir. Okay, our next speaker will be Lieutenant Colonel Donald Reimer. He just left the position of Department Head of Engineering Mechanics at USALFA and now currently serves as the military assistant to the Chief Scientist for Air Force Space Command. His paper titled Impeccability, a look at how a materials engineer views integrity at our academy, give us a unique perspective of integrity and the weaknesses and the strengths of that. So,
thanks. Well, this has been a lot of fun for me, mostly because I have had a chance to learn from some true experts on the panel. Dr. Lindsay, Dr. Johnson, Dr. Snyder, and Dr. Pierce, who was with us yesterday. For me to sort of jump into their world with an engineering analogy, a grand metaphor, has been kind of fun. It's sort of been for me looking in, one of these kids is not like the other kind of thing. I'm trying to figure out why they invited an engineer to the group, but I know engineers and scientists think differently, so let's see if that plays out. Go to the next slide. Impeccable. So I'm going to kill that microphone. This term is the term General Johnson used last fall when she spoke to a lot of leaders and said, this is what you're to be. You're to be impeccable. Now this came in the context of a lot of scrutiny, and we've gone through that, right? Some moral failures at different levels, whether they're cadets or permanent party. We're going to speak to both. But it caused me to think about it and think, well, what does that really mean? Because impeccable could be, if you look on the left side, perfect, an analogy for perfect or a synonym. But I give our superintendent a lot more credit than that. She's a Rhodes Scholar after all. I think it's more on the right. We need to be above reproach. And, the Latin, we'll use some more Latin in my talk too, sir. Peccare, right? To be henpecked, a peccadillo, something that can be, seen on the outside and grabbed. So hit the build here. I have chickens, I have goats. It's a lot of fun. We've got to give some chores to my kids, so it's fun to do that. When we had a situation where one of our guardian dogs got to one of our chickens, took off some feathers, a little bit of blood. Anybody know what happens to a chicken in the context of other chickens when there's a little bit of blood on the exposed skin? What the other chickens do? Anybody know? Put it on a farm? What happens? What? They peck on them. Those wounds will almost never heal because those other hens are going after that wound. That's what it means to be henpecked, right? This institution is very good, and I'm going to argue in somewhat, appropriately so by the media and other externals, to be henpecked when we have a moral failure, when we have an ethical problem, especially if it's widespread. Now, sometimes we're looking at, a tiny percent. But regardless, this is an important conversation to have. And being the geeky engineer, I'm going, I think I see where this is going, and I think I know what this looks like. So I've talked to my cadets all the time about integrity. We start lesson 1, we do every fall or spring with a lesson, a quick, what do you think about integrity? Because that's a word that's used a lot. Let's make sure it's not overused. Let's make sure we know what that really means and be honest with it. Speaking of, Carson Roberts, Colin Lane, Mitch Willis, Brett Daddiego, Ariel Bingaman, you guys all stand for a second. Is there anybody else from 350 last fall that I see in the room? Okay. So this class had the highest GPA or highest average of any class in the last 20 years. And these are some of those cadets. So thank you for being great cadets and being above reproach. Thank you very much. It's good to see you all. Next slide. So here's my analogy. People have defects. People have weaknesses. One could say there's a lot to henpeck in a person if you put them under a microscope. If you're married, I don't have to say much more, right? That's a good thing, by the way. That's a very good thing. To know those weaknesses, to look in the mirror or have your spouse yeah, you're right, babe. I missed that one up. I want to talk about engineering structure for a second. This is a simple cubic lattice. This is the basic building block for most metals. Actually, there's about 3 or 4 different types of structures of a cubic lattice for metals. But for this purpose, we're just going to use a simple cubic. If we go to the next slide, when you look at a crystal lattice, if you made everything with perfect crystals, we would have strengths 100 times, 10 to the 2, higher than we normally see in practice. And the reason for that is there's defects. We almost never see perfect lattices when we build structures. When we actually pour the ingot, right, molten metal into some structure, let it cool, it doesn't happen. There's defects. But we're still required to make sure that component doesn't fail. We can't have a Minnesota bridge incident. We've got to make sure we know and account for those defects. If you do the build, defects are real in people and materials. I think in engineering as a whole, we understand them well enough to account for them. I don't think we do that well enough when we're talking about character development. We don't enter that into the conversation. Okay, we'll continue. Next slide. Colin, what do we have on the left there? What's going on?
Misaligned grain boundaries.
Okay, so what do we call those lines? Right, and that's what kind of a defect?
Volume.
Volume, yeah, volume defects or line defects, depending on how big it is. Exactly. Mitch, do you remember what that extra plane of atoms becomes?
That was last year's class.
That was an edge dislocation. That's exactly right. These are 2 different kinds. This is as far as we're going to go technically, by the way. There's only going to be one other equation. Well done. I'm telling you, they were awesome. They were awesome. No, we'll stay on their side. What happens when you pour that ingot and let that molten metal just, cool and form the structure? Is those crystals never line up perfect. I mean, you're never going to get we've had the weather this week. You let the window, the frost, you have those crystals that just kind of start to form. That's what happens in metals. It's very similar. And you never will get those crystal orientations aligned. It's not going to happen. Now, there's ways to cool. Colin is looking at single crystal turbine blades and things that we do to really try to control that as much as possible, but that's hard to do. My point is, they're everywhere. There's millions of these in every single piece of metal we have. And then we're not just talking metals, we're talking wood, we're talking composites. Every structure has defects. Okay, you get the picture. Now, whether you can identify with any picture or meme up here or not, we're imperfect. We may spill the milk. Derek Jeter didn't hit every pitch. And we may be late for work. And be the most interesting late person in the world. But I'm not really talking about those. I'm talking about the ones further on this side of the slide. Right? Do you have an anger issue? Are you a control freak? Do you really find yourself loving money a lot? Does the opposite sex attract you to the point of a difficulty? Okay? These are areas of weakness that we don't account for. I don't think we ever account for. And I'm not saying, to go back to the previous conversation, that a bureaucracy, by the way, I want to preface this, should be in charge of mandating where those are. But I do think we need to make sure we know individually where those are and have that conversation. The Greek tragic flaw from Aristotle. I mean, that's what we're talking about here. So first, let's acknowledge the defects. We acknowledge them in engineering. What we do is we test things. We make sure we know they're already there. How strong are they? The chart on the left is when I pull, how much strength do I get? Okay, we won't go too much further with that. I've had enough geeks up in here for you. But we test this. We know what the strength is. Next slide. do we really understand what our weaknesses are and how they can play in an organization? Okay. If you'll build this, Colonel Ellis, retired 06, one of the prisoners of war with Admiral Stockdale and John McCain and those that came out of the Hanway Hilton. He's got a book, and he's actually got a leadership consulting group. And one of the first things they talk about is having the courage to address those weaknesses. Okay? One of the things that happens at the Air Force Academy is several 4 degrees self-select to say, I'm willing to be character coached. Okay? And in that character coaching, I'm a character coach right now. You ask the cadets to say, identify a virtue that you're willing to work on. There's 11 virtues that we give them a list on. And say, what do you really want to work on? Well, that's good. I mean, I think that's a good start. I think we ask them to pick one, and when they're coming to a lieutenant colonel to talk about their weakness, they're probably not going to pick, one that's not a low-hanging fruit. Okay? I mean, they're probably going to pick one that, okay, either I struggle in one area or I don't struggle in these areas, but here's an area I struggle with that I think there's an easy path to fix. I don't know. That's how I read it after having done this a little while. Are we really going to pick the weakness or the virtue that we're struggling with that could become that tragic flaw? Are we having those conversations? I think we can have those conversations. I think we can let individuals, like 4 degree to 4 degree, roommate to roommate, have those conversations. Say, are you having those conversations? We don't even know what they are. What are you doing? So we need to talk about the defects. We need to have 2 or 3 trusted friends, as Colonel Ellis points out, that's willing to talk to us about that, to keep us accountable. Slide. And yeah. Okay, so here's the second point. The second point is, there's this other thing we do in engineering. It's called a factor of safety. We know what that strength level is. We know what that stress that's going to break us is. Right? We know that 60,000 pounds per square inch will break us. But if we make sure that the component is only designed to see 30,000 KSI, we have a what? Factor of safety of 2. Bill? Yeah, there we go. Nice. Factor of safety of 2. Next slide. How often do we know we go out and we want to have a drink, and we know we have not given our keys to somebody, and we decide, I know I can take 2 drinks before I start to feel a buzz. So I'm going to have 1.5 or 1.75 drinks. Because I at least know buzz driving is drunk driving. We've heard yes on that. That's not much of a factor of safety. Or, I know if I talk about this subject with my friends, it's going to get a rise out of them. Or if I post something on Yik Yak, actually let's be more specific. Let's post something in Facebook where our name is attributed to it. And I use terminology that is sort of gets around the point, but I'm not really hitting the buzzword that's really going to send somebody high right. Yeah, you're not giving much of a factor of safety. That's not a lot of factor of safety in character. Go ahead and build the rest of this. So there's a story. I'll tell a quick story in the middle of this point. The story goes like this: a limousine driver, but in a horse and carriage days, is interviewing for actually a lord. He's interviewing for his limousine driver. And he says, okay, there's this precipice, there's this curve. And it's a 100-foot drop. I have to go around it all the time. How close to the edge of that curve can you drive that horse and buggy before you're not comfortable? And the first interviewee's like, well, I think I can get within a foot of that precipice of the opening. The second says, I think I can get within 6 inches of that precipice and not send you over. And the last guy comes in and says, sir, it's not my job to see how close to the edge I can put that buggy, but how far I can keep you from the edge. That guy gets hired. And that's what we're talking about. we can't continue to take topics and things that are sort of volatile, our feelings about certain issues, whatever they are, that we know could end up offending. We know, my tendency to be, have a temper, right? We have to know those exist, and we have to have that conversation, and we have to not push this all the way to the edge. Okay, and the third point, yeah, this is, let's leave it here. Yeah, this means much, much greater than one. That's what those two, that's what the geeks do. Okay, next. The last one is this. Now, here's my last big point. It turns out, we're going to go back to that defect discussion for a second. It turns out that it's a good thing that I have a polycrystalline material that I know has defects running all over that matrix. Because if I left it the perfect crystal lattice, let's go back to that 100 times strength discussion we had before. If I left it that way, the minute I got one break in that crystal lattice, even though it's really strong, but on a macro level, I have a dent in the external side of some component. And that creates, at the microscopic level, that little break. The next load, this thing can unzip. It's called fast fracture. The thing is gone. It's not what we call damage tolerant. So if I know defects and can control them, it turns out my defects can become a strength. And what we have going on here, I know some of these guys are in Mech 340 right now. We've got what kind of, what do we have going on in that lattice structure? We have interstitial, yeah. We have extra atoms like alloys. When I put alloys in there, when I put aluminum with another metal, I can get different size atoms that get melted in with the other base metal. That takes heat, that takes stress, and then that takes a cooling that makes sure that I leave a sort of strained feel. It's not a perfectly lined structure. It causes some tension. It's hard to just let that happen. You can't just let that happen. You got to make it happen. But it strengthens the metal. I don't unzip anymore. It's not a perfect path. It's got bumps in it, and I can't just take a zipper and with a dent and make it fast fracture. This slide shows, all this is showing that when I have different sized atoms paired with a base atom, I get a huge increase in strength. That's all that chart's trying to say. So go try it. What are atoms? My point is, I do believe the diversity that we have in the Air Force and are trying to do more of it, that can make us stronger, big time. Different views, different perspective. That's big. Next slide. But we've got to control our defects after we know them to strengthen ourselves. So let's build this out. We have to be willing to get uncomfortable. It's not easy. We have to look each other in the eye and say, you know what? I see this in you. This is dangerous. I see how you reacted to what she was talking about, and that could get you in trouble. That could give you an EEO hit. I've seen cadets counsel each other this way, and I've seen a cadet not respond to it. And I've seen a cadet fall morally or ethically after not hearing that warning. And that's dangerous. So keep going. We get stronger. Anyway, Colonel Ellis continues that honor your values, lean into your pain, and intentionally engage issues with strength and humility. We've got to do that. We've got to have this conversation. Okay, let's finish this thing off. I told you that one of the best parts of me being asked to join this august group was that I actually got to talk to some really brilliant minds in some of this field, especially professional arms, the ethics. You've heard Dr. Snyder. He's, if I had half of what he's forgotten, I'd be a much stronger leader. But this
we're not giving you Chick-fil-A for saying that.
Thank you. I appreciate that. Here's some of the things that they've said. I'm taking and I'm applying cadets into Dr. Johnson's paper, because one of the things that she said is we identify, when you hear her after the break, you need to listen to this. Cadets will identify with different roles, right? You have AD. Cadets will consciously or subconsciously negotiate those identities, or have to. Think about that for a second. Subconsciously identifying with a specific role. Okay? Now, the last point is subjective importance or situational relevance of these identities serve as determinants for attitudes, behavior, and actions. Now, if that cadet has not really taken account of his weaknesses or strengths, again, we tout our strengths very well, but if we have not looked at those weaknesses, that subconscious path to actions is dangerous. It's extremely dangerous. Dr. Pierce, who couldn't be with us today, but boy, was it great to have him on the panel too. So he talked about virtue and how virtue leads to the discussion of character. He says, he quotes James Davis and Hunter, the most basic element of character is moral discipline. Right? Moral discipline, right and wrong. Its most essential feature is the inner capacity for restraint and ability to inhibit oneself in one's passions, desires, and habits. Huge. That's huge. Okay? And then, Dr. Snyder's talk, he talked about the Army having 8 different, and there could have been more when you talk to Dr. Snyder, more foundations individually. That's because that's where we're at on this on his whole chart. Well, I'm talking about that individual moral foundation that we have to develop if we're really developing leaders of character here. I think it's important. Where is our moral foundation here? What do we use? We have the 11 virtues. We've got the 3 core values, but what does it mean when you're talking brass tacks on individual decisions? What have we given the cadets to really do that? I think they come in with it from wherever they grew up, and for the most part, it works. But I don't think we can assume that it will always work, and that we don't need to have that conversation. Next slide. These are the questions to ponder for us, at least for me. As we rightly accept the continued diversity of strength, do we undoubtedly admit also other weaknesses into our fabric? I think we might. I think we should know what those are. What are our blind spots? What are our assumptions? What are our habits of mind that we bring to this institution? Permanent party as well, not just talking cadets. We've got to know what those are. Well, I had a chance to participate with the critical thinking outcome team here, and one of the first elements of critical thinking is self-awareness, and it's what are the biases and assumptions and things that I bring to this discussion, whether we're talking about critical thinking about engineering or just life. We've got to know what those are. The second big point is our 11 virtues. I've already talked about this, 3 core values. I talked about coaching. I think we have a, if you go to the last part, I think we have a, Dr. Snyder's slide talked about a values to virtues gap. I think we have a virtues to moral, and I think we need to fill. Let's work to be honest about our weaknesses, whether it's peers, close friends, family. Let's work on making those weak areas stronger, and never design to the limit. Never ever make moral decisions or make what you think is a casual decision because, and by the way, I understand, I'm a grad, 95, prize gold, firsties, that you live in this world where your personal life is your professional life and your home is your workplace, and those worlds are like, where's my line, right? Where's my time? Well, having that line blurred is that's actually a good thing. Because it forces you to remember that I am on duty to the public 24/7. And I've got to think about how every personal decision could impact me professionally. That's a good thing to have a conversation. So last little build is just be impeccable. I think we can do it. I think we can have integrity and still have defects, but let's in the aggregate talk about how those roll up. So I want to let Cadet Goins, he's been my cadet partner, to quickly reflect on this, and hopefully we still have some more time for discussion.
So I've basically been looking at this and what it's going to look like for me as a cadet and as developing into a leader. So, first of all, is that we can't really fail because the nation deserves more than that, and we have people who are there looking up to us. We can't have that failure. And even though we have defects, we have to know where they are, like he said. So what's that going to take? It's going to take that talking and trust. That's why Dr. Snyder said that the currency of a profession is trust. It's what's going to get you to be able to build each other up inside the profession as well as trust outside the profession. So whatever that's going to look like for each of you, you have to be able to find someone who you trust enough to share your flaws with, to become vulnerable. Because if you don't know the defects, you don't know when you're going to crack. And then, secondly, on the factor of safety, I know personally that, yeah, I've known before you don't go right up to the line with everything. But I've never thought of it in context that we're looking for factors of safety of 2 or 3, and that really will keep us safe. It's going to be a lot harder to do because it requires you having a lot more situational awareness and knowing what you're getting into, but it really will help in the end. And finally, you have to have that moral foundation that he's talking about, and we have to have the place to build our ethics up from, because if you do not, then the whole rest of the structure is useless. And then one last thing is that when you know your defects and you've talked to someone about them, that is what allows you to build it up and have your defects actually become stronger areas, because someone else is there to help you, and there's another angle in the defects that will be stronger in that way, that will cover it in the end.
Thanks. We'd love to take questions, comments. What's hard about this? Let's talk about it.
I just think the concept of all the trust thing is really interesting as a whole institution. As cadets, we are here, we like to think that we are a huge family in the whole cadet wing, but to me sometimes it's more that we are just individuals who are competing against each other towards, I don't know, a pilot squad come, whatever trophy that you are seeking. And I'm just wondering, how can you actually like build that environment of trust and like, hey, cadets, so-and-so, you know what, I'm really weak in keeping myself accountable on some area and whatever, and sharing that weaknesses. And at the same time, that person, I'm actually competing with him for I don't know what. So how can you like overcome that competitors and friends and family environment that's kind of interconnected?
Well, I'll let Cadet Goins jump in here too. I will say that I would doubt that every single colleague, to expand it not just beyond the cadets, is really there to compete against you, where there's not at least whether it's friendship or collegiality. So, but if we take this where we've discussed, and I agree with Aaron. I think we can become strong. We do become stronger when we admit this is an area I've got to work on. Well, if that's the case, then you're going to become stronger than that other cadet that you're competing against. Now, I also feel like let's take the profession, let's take the discussion of the profession and the trust. I mean, that currency is huge. That currency is, and let me expand. We've had this other discussion as a sidebar. I think it was Colonel Witzel and I were chatting about. This is a great place to make friends for life. I mean, huge. And when I say that, I mean guys that I have not seen in 20 years, you know, they're emailing me because they're retiring, and they said, hey, I lost my cadet scarf and I want to put it in my shadow box. Is anybody in the academy? I'm like, yeah, I got you. I'll send one to you. I mean, that's just what you do. That is what you do. And you will find that competition fades fast as a member of a class. And if it doesn't, well, let's just say making enemies here is not a very good idea either. You want to fix those bridges that have been burned if there are some of those areas of friction. I want to let Aaron jump in.
Dr. Schneider talked about how you can put the calling above yourself because of the profession we're in. So one, you have to do that. And then two, once you build that friendship and trust, hopefully you don't compete against your friends. You don't have to feel like that. And that also, life really isn't a zero-sum game. Just because one person gets something good to happen to them doesn't mean somebody else inherently has to have something bad or miss something. So you should always be able to root for your friends because you want the best for them.
Let me give you a quick story. Well, I'm going to take more questions, but I graduated in the mech major in '95. There was a guy that was our GSP ahead of me, and then my roommate was actually the #1 mech. Well, he left the Air Force after 5 years because he became a doctor. He's like, you know, I used to say engineering is too easy for me. And then the other guy is now an 06 select, and you know, done one below twice. And when I talked to Doug, my roommate, he goes, "You're the department head of mech?" And it was just filling in for a year and a half. He goes, "I feel like I had something to do with that." Yeah, you're right, you did. So you sell I mean, you might say I was competing with these guys, but it never felt that way. We're studying, we're learning together. We're in this to win this. You know, we're battling the dean, right? That's how it comes across in dean. That's what it's all about. And I think there's more of that than you see. More questions and comments. I think we got a couple more minutes still. Yeah, back here.
Sir, in this presentation, we talked a lot about understanding your own personal weakness. My concern comes in with, in the military, we have missions that are required to get done. And as a commander, our job is to see that they get done. How do we morally justify pushing someone past their breaking point if we know it in order to achieve that mission?
I want to separate the personal breaking point from a duty standpoint and what I talk about individual personal weaknesses. It's every leader's job to know the limits of their people. Every leader's job. I mean, I think you can go around this room. I know there's folks that have worn the uniform that are not wearing it now. And that is incumbent on every leader. And so, and I think we surprise ourselves with the limits that we can push ourselves when it's the mission and the team. I categorize it differently than personal, you know, a tendency of a vice or something that could trip me up morally. And I think we do a good job of navigating that difference. I'm just trying to help us address an area that we don't have a conversation about enough. That's all. Does that help? I don't know.
My question is more of, let's say I have a team.
Yep.
And I know, as a good leader, I know what all their breaking points are.
Right.
But I have a mission that is going to require one of these people, at minimum, to push past it.
Right.
How, as a leader, and I don't have any other options, I have
Right.
this team.
Yep.
How, as a leader, can I come to grips with that by potentially breaking a person?
Okay. Now,
strengths.
I'm a cadet, so are we talking physical? Are we talking like push-ups?
No, we're talking like mental, like serious mental things, sir.
Right. Well, again, if I'm not asking you to do something immoral, then there is a, especially here as a cadet, there is a training and growth where I don't know what my limits are until I've gone there. And some of what we do in an academy is pushing that intentionally. So don't take my factor of safety analogy and say we should not be stretching ourselves professionally past every point we thought we had. In fact, there are speeches abound. Michael Jordan, got cut from his high school basketball team. right? He didn't let that say, okay, I've hit my limit, you know, right? And the Tar Heels are glad he didn't, right? So so there's a difference. There's a distinct difference. I think morally, we've got to run as far from the edge as possible, especially, I mean, I'm not saying, again, police and bureaucracy. We need to know what that is.
May I have a point?
Yes, please do.
Yeah, there's a bias in all the military professions against failure. An intense bias, and that's because of the nature of the work of the profession. However, in the developmental processes of individual professionals, failure is not a bad thing. In fact, failure is a good thing. Go to your Behavioral Science and Leadership Department, and read the literature on how much development occurs through failure as opposed to how much development occurs through success. And it's a factor of 3 or 4 differential. We learn far more from failure than we learn from success. We have to realign the cognitive structures up here because we have to ask ourselves, what went wrong? Why did that happen? I used to have fun with the cadets at West Point asking them, okay, tell me about an abject failure in your life. And I could go around the section room day after day, and cadets had never failed at anything. And I would say, well, how do you think you're going to deal the first time you fail? Why don't you get out of here and go fail at something? I wasn't being facetious. This is solid social psychological research. We know that we learn and develop in that instance much more from failure than we do from success, because our reaction to success is, oh, it's the same thing that happened before. I can just keep doing what I'm doing. Oh, I got this down. I know how to do this. All done. And you will not be self-reflective on what really happened and what you really need to deal with. And the same thing is, don't forget, when you get the commission and go out in the Air Force, you're going to accomplish your mission as teams, not as individuals. So it's all right if you think the team can accomplish the mission, to stress some individuals right up to the level that they're learning things about themselves.
Friends, we are glad that you've had a lot of questions, and we have about a 20-minute break in between our 2 sessions, but we do want to let everybody get to the places that they're going. So, Dr. Snyder, Colonel Reimer, we thank you very much for being here. We got a little